Hello. I want us to look at what the professor of the future might be like. And you might wonder, well, why does that have anything to do with creating or developing materials for online education? Well, it really does have everything to do with it because it's the professor who has so much to say about what goes into the content of a course. So let's look at what the future might hold for new professors. We know that faculty at colleges and universities around the world are very busy, and they're still going to be that way 10 years or 20 years from now. They're expected to give lectures, juggle meetings, do their grading, interact with students, and also do research in their area of content. But I wonder if it'll always be that way. What will the professor at a university or a college be doing in the year 2020? And to answer that question, I'm going to give you several fictitious professors, and we're going to talk about what they're doing in the future. The future is not necessarily a straight line from the past. So let's look at some habits of the professors of the future and see how those might link to development of materials for online education. The first thing that might change is how the professor gets their information. And this can be information that they're sharing with students in lectures, or it can be information that they might need for their research. This futuristic happening is happening today. It's just barely starting. We have RSS feeds, and if you don't know what that is, do a quick look for an RSS feed. There's also new magazine-like search engines. So if you wanted to do a search or your topic or your lecture was going to be on global warming, you can have journals from all over the globe automatically send you the latest research. So it's no longer necessary to do your own searches and your own Google searches and your own tours through the library. The second habit that I want to share with you is continuous course construction. So instead of developing the materials for an online class once and then presenting it to students several times, the new professors are going to be changing it almost weekly. So let's take Professor Jones. He's a senior undergraduate business professor. And he gives challenges that are real world problems to his students weekly. And these challenges may change. For example, he may say, what drives productivity in an organization? What hinders productivity? That might be one of his real world problems that his students are going to be solving. For each of these challenges that Professor Jones gives, the students work together in collaborative groups, or sometimes they work by themselves, and they do their own research, which may be coming to them through RSS feeds or coming to them by eZines. They may be looking at things like YouTube University, iTunes University. So the material that is going to be used to answer the questions that Professor Jones poses to his classes changes as the world changes. If our classes are going to continuously be changing and being reconstructed, let's look at another professor. This is Dr. Wilkins, and he teaches an electrician apprenticeship program. And he wants his students to be able to know how to wire or rewire, let's say, rewire an old house that was built in 1984. So instead of taking them out to the job site where he has had to do that in the past, he can now do a real world 3D simulation of the wiring. He can then challenge his students to see the differences in rewiring an old house or wiring for brand new construction. And he can update and change his class as often as he needs to. One of the other habits that a futuristic professor may have in their development of course materials is collaboration on a big scale. So today, many professors collaborate with their peers right there at the same university. They may collaborate with other professors when they go to conferences or do some video conferences, but really it's mostly done within that university itself. Let's look at Dr. Gibson. And Dr. Gibson remembers when she only had colleagues that she communicated with within her own university. But in the future, she will be able to use more and more video conferencing, more and more video simulations to be able to collaborate with 10, 20, 30 of her colleagues around the world. Just think about all of the new information that she's going to be able to get from colleagues who are doing similar things to hers, but they're doing them in a different country and with different people. Let's take that collaboration one step farther, and we'll look at Dr. Sanders, and she teaches sustainable development and climate change at a university. In the past, her students got to read about climate change. They got to look at some charts. They got to do some research online. But today, through this massive amount of collaboration that's possible, each of her students has a part in monitoring the sea levels around the world. So each one of them has a link to a particular monitoring station. They get that data weekly, and then they present it as a collaborative group to the professor and to the class. So they're learning not only what's happening in their own backyard, but they're learning what's happening to global change around the world through collaboration. Another habit that we will probably see in the very near future is the way that we assess students. And today, a group of students all starts at the same time. They all get the same content. They all hear the same lectures, and they all finish at the same time. It doesn't need to be that way. The future says that a student would have a learning passport. So they might enter this class on online development of course materials, and when they feel that they have completed the first couple of modules and they're ready for an assessment, they contact the instructor and say they're ready for the assessment, and the professor gives them the assessment at that time. They can then take off a week or two if they need to, or they can move right on. So they're not all traveling through the course at the same amount of time. The assessments also are going to be changing because the professor no longer needs to just use a paper, pencil, or a quiz or a test to assess the students. It's going to become much more project-based. So you may have finished the first 2 modules of your course. You think you're ready to be assessed, and so you would be given a real-world challenge from your professor that you would need to solve. Sometimes that solving happens in a collaborative group, and sometimes it's an individual effort. Think a little bit farther about that new kind of assessment that I'm talking about, where the student decides when they're ready to be assessed. So in this way, the student is demonstrating their new knowledge and understanding of that topic. It's based more on what they've learned and what they can demonstrate rather than on time in the seat or time in front of the computer. Now, I've talked earlier about the Carnegie unit and time on task. Think about that. If we're going to assess students when they're ready to be assessed and give them challenges to solve, then how do we determine time on task? And do we need to? What will the future bring in that area? Another habit of a future professor might be creating new resources. So instead of having the textbook that you carry around all the time, or even the e-book that's on your computer, future students may begin receiving up-to-the-minute information from their professors as the professors are creating materials for online learning. Professor Miller teaches entrepreneurship. And so twice during the semester, Professor Miller goes out to 2 businesses. He chooses them carefully, and here's why. He chooses the first one because it's a failing business. He interviews the owner, the manager, he interviews anyone that will talk with him. He then chooses a successful business that's about the same age, that's been in business for about the same number of days or weeks or months. He interviews those. And then he presents his students with a comparison of those 2 businesses. So they're really getting a way to look at his website, to get the latest information, and to learn from real world experiences. Let me give you another example of a professor who is continually creating new material for her students. This is Professor Suma, and she teaches physics and mathematics at the college level. And she knows that her students find math and physics difficult to understand and don't really see the application of some of the principles of those 2 content areas to real-world problems. Well, Dr. Suma has connected her students with a game development company. This is a company that wants to have students work with them and use their physics and math backgrounds to help develop the games. Suddenly, the challenge and the reason to learn physics is becoming more fun for her students. The game company develops products for sale in partnering with this university. And then they get to beta test the newest and latest games. Sometimes they beta test games that they didn't develop, but then they have to decide how physics and math played into that particular new game. Let's look at another habit of our future professor. This is face-to-face teaching and learning sessions. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, we're talking about online education. But despite predictions that face-to-face education was going to go away and be totally replaced by online, that hasn't happened. And a look into the future says that it probably will not. It's a key role of an instructor, a professor, to engage directly with the students. And the key role of students is to engage with the professor and with each other. And we know that can be done online. But what we're seeing is in the face-to-face instruction, the professor is not lecturing. That can be done online. What the professor is doing is demonstrating a skill. And then he is watching students one by one and observing if they understood it or they didn't and how he can re-demonstrate that. So if we look at Professor Simmons, who teaches welding, he can certainly do a demonstration with his students, or someone who teaches cooking, or think about the other classes that might be available where you'd want to pull your students together and make sure they're understanding the concept. We're seeing this happen quite a lot these days in medical schools. So see if you can think of other areas of content that the face-to-face learning might be a good scenario. Let's just take a minute and think about those professors that I've talked to you about who are teaching in the year 2020. What changes in the future is not the need, for students to gain knowledge and understanding, learning and skills, but it's how we enable this learning to take place. If we're freed from only delivering the content, then we have more time as professors of the future to engage in our students, to make sure that they're mastering the learning outcomes, to personalize the learning, and that allows the student to move forward at their own pace and be assessed, as I was talking about, when they're ready to be assessed. And it gives more meaning to the learning. Suddenly, the students are given challenges that are real world challenges, such as being able to develop that game for the game company. Equally, if we're freed from some of the aspects of assessing our students, and we can do these in new, more challenging ways, then the learning is bound to increase for students. If we're free from the Carnegie unit, which determines learning in terms of time on task or time in your seat, and hours of teaching, and focus instead on the outcomes, then more people can earn more credit for things they already know and learned on their own. Do we always have to sit in a classroom to learn? There's so much out there and so many other ways that we can be learning, but that will only come when we start to see the professor of the future.